The calm before the storm. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden light over the busy streets of the city. It was the kind of afternoon where the air seemed to hum with the energy of the world. Yet Vivian Sinclair, the black billionaire businesswoman, found herself retreating into the solitude of a quiet street corner. She had learned long ago that moments of peace were rare for someone like her. She had fought for everything she had: her position, her success, and even her right to exist without being constantly scrutinized. Dressed in simple clothes, no expensive brand names, no flashy accessories, Vivian blended in with the crowd. She was used to this. People rarely recognized her when she dressed down, and that was just the way she liked it. She didn't want to be the flashy billionaire who lived in the public eye. She had lived that life before, and it hadn't been fulfilling. What she craved, what she cherished now, was the rare tranquility of anonymity. Her eyes scanned the street, watching the gentle bustle of city life. To the world, Vivian was a success story, a self-made billionaire, a philanthropist, a woman who had risen from the struggles of a poor, dangerous neighborhood to become a leader in the world of business. But beneath the polished exterior, Vivian carried the weight of her past, the struggles and scars that had shaped her into the woman she was today. Growing up in the roughest parts of the city, Vivian had learned early that survival was about more than just physical strength. It was about resilience, grit, and determination to rise above the prejudice that clung to her like a second skin. She had faced countless obstacles in her life: discrimination, poverty, violence, and the oppressive weight of being a black woman in a world that often saw her as invisible or, worse, a threat. Yet Vivian had never given up. She had pushed forward, broken barriers, and defied expectations. Now, as she sat on the corner of this peaceful street, the gentle hum of traffic in the background, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. She had earned everything she had through years of hard work, perseverance, and sacrifice. Her success was not just about money. It was about proving to herself and the world that she could achieve greatness, no matter the odds stacked against her. But today, as she sat in this quiet corner of the city, there was a sense of unease that crept into her chest. It was the same feeling she got when she sensed something wasn't right, when the world around her seemed to shift in subtle ways, like the calm before a storm. She wasn't sure why, but her instincts told her that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. The clack of boots against the pavement was sharp and deliberate, cutting through the air. Vivian turned her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she saw the figure approaching in the distance. It was Officer Walker. Vivian had heard of him before. Officer Walker was known around the city for his reputation, his harsh demeanor, his unpredictable behavior, and the way he seemed to target certain individuals with a particular kind of venom. He had a history of abusing his power, and many people had whispered about his actions behind closed doors. But so far, nothing had been done to stop him. He was untouchable, or so it seemed. Vivian could see him now, his eyes scanning the street as he walked toward her. His uniform was crisp, his boots polished, but his face was filled with disdain. She could feel the tension in the air as he neared, the unease in her gut growing. As Walker came closer, Vivian kept her gaze steady. She didn't react, didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that the best way to handle people like him was to remain calm, to show them that they couldn't rattle her. She wasn't just any woman sitting on a street corner. She was Vivian Sinclair, someone who had endured and survived far worse than a cop with a chip on his shoulder. Walker's eyes locked onto hers as he approached, and a sneer curled on his lips. "You think you can just sit here, don't you?" His voice was loud, mocking, dripping with contempt. Vivian didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him. He was trying to provoke her, to assert his dominance over her in the way that many people like him did, but she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "I said," he continued, his voice growing harsher, "you think you can just hang around here? This is a nice neighborhood. People like you don't belong here." Vivian's heart began to race, but she didn't let her exterior show any sign of vulnerability. She could feel the weight of his words, the underlying racism that dripped from his every syllable. But she had faced much worse in her life. She had endured far more than the petty prejudices of an ignorant cop. This wasn't about her. This was about him, his need to prove something to himself, to others, to the world. He saw her, a black woman, sitting on a street corner, and his mind immediately jumped to conclusions. He saw her as an intruder, as someone who didn't belong in a place like this, and that was enough for him to feel justified in his actions. Vivian remained silent, her eyes steady and unblinking. She wasn't going to engage in this fight, not here, not now. She had learned that sometimes the best response was no response at all. But her calm exterior hid the storm brewing inside her, an anger that she had worked hard to suppress over the years, but that now threatened to spill over. She had seen enough of this kind of treatment. "You don't belong here," Officer Walker repeated, his voice now laced with more aggression. He took a step closer, towering over her, his body language threatening. Vivian clenched her fists in her lap, a subtle action that no one would notice, but it was a release of the tension building inside her. She had fought too hard for too long to let a man like this intimidate her. "You need to move on," Walker demanded, his eyes narrowing, his voice rising. But Vivian didn't move. She remained seated, her gaze unwavering. She knew that she had every right to be here, just as much as anyone else. And more than that, she had earned her place in this world, something that Officer Walker, in his ignorance and prejudice, could never understand. "Is there a problem here, officer?" A voice suddenly interrupted, cutting through the tension like a blade. Vivian's heart skipped a beat as she turned to see who had spoken. She hadn't heard anyone approach, but now a figure stood just a few paces away, watching the interaction unfold with quiet intensity. The voice belonged to someone Vivian recognized, a familiar face from her past, someone who had been a witness to many of the battles she had fought, someone who had stood by her side during the darkest days of her journey. And they knew, just as she did, that this moment wasn't just about a cop and a woman on a street corner. It was about something much bigger. Vivian's instincts told her that this was only the beginning. Something had shifted in the air, something that would lead to a revelation no one could have predicted. And she would be at the center of it all. What would Officer Walker do now? Would he back down, or would he escalate the situation further? As the tension hung thick in the air, Vivian prepared herself for whatever was coming next. The truth, as she had learned time and time again, had a way of revealing itself when least expected, and it had a tendency to change everything. The breaking point. The atmosphere on the street corner seemed to hang in suspended animation, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Officer Walker stood over Vivian Sinclair, his posture stiff with authority, his face twisted in an expression of barely contained contempt. He was accustomed to being in control, to exerting power over anyone who crossed his path, especially those he deemed out of place. But something about Vivian, her calm, her quiet dignity, wasn't yielding to his intimidation tactics. Vivian felt the weight of his gaze, a sharp and unrelenting scrutiny, but she refused to let her composure slip. She had been in tight spots before, facing down hostile boardrooms, combative shareholders, and even more dangerous situations during her rise from the grim streets of her youth. Nothing had been handed to her. Everything she had achieved was the result of fierce determination, and she would not let this man rob her of her peace so easily. The sudden voice that interrupted the tension hanging between them brought a small wave of relief, though she dared not show it. Her heart skipped a beat when she recognized who it was. It was Maya Lawson, the journalist. Maya had been an ally of Vivian's for years. She was known for her investigative work on police corruption, systemic racism, and other social injustices. Their paths had crossed a number of times, and Maya had become one of the few people Vivian trusted outside her immediate circle. Maya knew the truth about Vivian's past, her struggles and her triumphs. Maya also knew about the relentless obstacles Vivian had faced, the biases, and the judgments she had fought against to get to where she was. Maya's reputation for digging deep into hidden truths had earned her both respect and enemies. Vivian had always admired her tenacity. If there was anyone who could expose the rotten underbelly of this moment, it was Maya. But even then, Vivian wasn't entirely sure she was ready for the world to know everything. As Maya approached, Officer Walker's gaze flickered, narrowing. His eyes locked onto Maya with a mixture of suspicion and irritation. He could feel his authority slipping just slightly. He wasn't used to his actions being challenged so directly, especially in public. "What's this?" Walker growled, his tone dripping with disdain. "You got a problem with how I'm doing my job." Maya didn't flinch. Her presence alone was enough to unsettle him. Her sharp eyes and quick wit were always a formidable combination. Maya had a knack for getting under people's skin, for questioning everything, especially when it came to power dynamics. "I'm just here as a witness, officer," Maya said, her voice cool but firm. She took a step closer to Vivian, casting a glance at her, then returning her gaze to Walker. "I don't think Ms. Sinclair needs to be harassed for simply sitting here. You're out of line." Walker scoffed, rolling his eyes as he took another step forward, trying to assert his dominance over the situation. "Harassed? You think I'm harassing her? I'm just doing my job, making sure people like her don't cause trouble." He gestured dismissively toward Vivian, his voice growing louder. "I'm just making sure she knows her place." Vivian's fists clenched in her lap, the muscle in her jaw tightening. She could hear the venom in his words, the implication that she, a woman who had built an empire from the ground up, didn't belong here, that she was somehow lesser. Maya wasn't about to let him continue. "Let's make one thing clear, officer," she said, stepping even closer, her gaze hardening. "There's no place in this world where people like her don't belong, and that includes this neighborhood. This isn't about her place. This is about your clear attempt to intimidate someone who has as much right to be here as you do." The words struck like a whip, leaving an indelible mark in the air. Officer Walker's nostrils flared as he glared at Maya, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed as though he might snap. His authority had been challenged, not only by a woman sitting on a street corner, but by a journalist who wasn't afraid to speak out. The tension between the two was palpable. It was the kind of standoff that could escalate quickly if either side made the wrong move. Vivian, still sitting on the curb, continued to watch silently, but now her mind was racing. She was trying to process what had just happened. In one moment, she had been alone, unseen, unremarkable, sitting on a street corner, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. And now, within minutes, her world had shifted. She wasn't just a woman minding her own business. She was a target of prejudice, of hate, and an unfair system. And she wasn't the only one who was about to be caught up in the storm. Officer Walker's anger was growing, his face turning redder with each passing second. "You need to get out of here," he spat, turning his attention to Maya. "Both of you. Now." Maya stood her ground. "You're not in control here, officer. You've crossed the line, and you know it." For a brief moment, Vivian was unsure whether the situation would remain verbal or spiral into something worse. She had seen officers like Walker before, people who believed their uniform gave them the right to treat others as they wished. But there was something more than just this single interaction. The unjust treatment Vivian had endured in silence for years now seemed to be bubbling to the surface. The sound of approaching footsteps reached Vivian's ears, and she looked over her shoulder to see a small crowd gathering. People had started to notice the confrontation. Some were watching from nearby buildings. Others were standing across the street. Vivian felt the prickle of their gazes on her, felt the heat of their judgment, their curiosity. She had always been in control of how people saw her. Until now, Vivian had spent years carefully curating her public persona, positioning herself as a successful businesswoman who had made it in a world that didn't always welcome women, let alone black women. But the truth was, she had always felt the eyes on her, the subtle racial prejudice, the doubt in the eyes of the people who were never truly convinced she belonged at the top. She had grown accustomed to the whispers and sideways glances, but today, the tension in the air was different. This wasn't just about some random bystander making assumptions. This was an officer of the law, someone who was supposed to protect people, targeting her simply because of her presence. Vivian's mind raced. What if things escalated? What if Walker decided to make an example of her? He had no idea who she really was. He didn't know her past, her struggle, or the silent wars she had fought for years. He didn't know how many times she had been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed, simply because of the color of her skin. He certainly didn't know that his actions today could be the spark that ignited something much bigger. Before Vivian could react further, another voice cut through the tension. This one was sharp and commanding. "Officer, step back." It was another officer, but not just any officer. It was Detective Lena Carter, a well-known figure in the city. Detective Carter was known for her integrity, her level-headedness, and her reputation for standing up for what was right, even when it meant challenging her own department. Vivian had heard of her before, though they had never met. Detective Carter was one of the few in law enforcement who had earned a reputation for investigating corruption within the police force. She had crossed paths with Walker a few times, and from what Vivian had heard, the two didn't exactly see eye to eye. "Let her go, Walker," Detective Carter said calmly but firmly. Her presence was immediate and commanding, and for the first time, Vivian saw Officer Walker hesitate. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Vivian held her breath, wondering what would come next. Would Walker back down, or would he try to fight this? Either way, she knew one thing. Her world was changing, and it wouldn't be the same after today. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, was about to be tested in ways she never imagined. The hidden truths. The standoff on the quiet corner was nothing short of explosive, the air thick with the tension of what could be a turning point in Vivian Sinclair's life. She sat there, poised and calm on the sidewalk, her mind racing through the labyrinth of possibilities. The moment Detective Lena Carter intervened had been a breath of relief, but Vivian knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The ripples of this encounter would spread far beyond this street, and nothing would be the same again. Officer Walker took one final look at Vivian, his eyes burning with a mix of frustration and contempt. His fingers twitched at his sides, itching to reassert control. But with Detective Carter standing firmly between him and his target, the fire in his eyes began to fade, replaced by a simmering, impotent rage. He didn't want to back down, but at the same time, he knew it was futile to continue. The power struggle was over. For now. "I'll let you off the hook this time, Sinclair," Walker muttered through clenched teeth, but the words were meant more as a threat than an apology. He gave a last, defiant glance at Detective Carter before he turned and stalked off down the street, muttering under his breath. The sound of his retreating footsteps echoed, gradually fading into the distance. Vivian remained seated, her fingers still clenched tightly at her sides, but the storm within her had not yet passed. It was like an electric current running through her veins, a surge of anger and frustration that had been building for years, and now it had found its outlet. She had never liked confrontation, but sometimes, it was the only way to make people see the truth. Detective Carter knelt down beside her, her eyes scanning Vivian's face with a mix of concern and admiration. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice low and measured, as though she were afraid to disturb the fragile calm between them. Vivian nodded slowly, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. Thanks for stepping in." The truth, however, was that Vivian was far from fine. Her heart was still racing, her body still tense from the weight of what had just happened. She had never been one to show weakness, but today had been different. Today, the vulnerability she had worked so hard to keep hidden had been exposed, not just to Officer Walker, but to the world, whether they knew it or not. Detective Carter looked around, then gently placed a hand on Vivian's shoulder, offering a sense of reassurance. "This isn't over, you know," she said, her voice firm. "Walker will probably go back and try to make your life difficult. He's got a history of pulling stuff like this, and if he thinks he can get away with it, he will. But you're not alone in this." Vivian met her gaze, searching for any hint of doubt in the detective's eyes. But there was none. There was only resolve. Detective Carter had a reputation for standing by the victims of abuse, for calling out corruption wherever she found it. Vivian knew that if anyone could help her now, it was her. "I don't want to make a scene," Vivian replied, her voice steady but tinged with the weariness that had settled in her bones. "I've fought my entire life to keep a low profile. I've built this empire, not for fame or attention, but to create something real, something that matters." She paused, her gaze drifting to the spot on the sidewalk where Officer Walker had stood just moments before. "I don't need people to pity me. I just want to keep moving forward." Detective Carter studied her for a moment, as if weighing her words. Then, without warning, she pulled out a small notebook from her coat pocket and handed it to Vivian. "Write it down," she said. "You don't have to make a scene, but you do need to make a record of what happened. If you want to avoid dealing with this kind of thing again, you have to take control of the narrative. And I'll back you up. But we have to start with the truth." Vivian looked at the notebook in her hand, feeling its weight more than its physical presence. It was a reminder that the world, for all its gloss and power, still had a way of keeping its darkest secrets hidden, buried beneath layers of silence, ignorance, and fear. Her success had not shielded her from the world's prejudices. If anything, it had made her a target. The more she rose, the more people like Officer Walker and others who harbored similar biases would try to tear her down. But Detective Carter was right. She could no longer afford to hide. If she wanted to truly make a difference, to stand for the people who had been overlooked and oppressed, she had to confront her past, her truth, and expose it. She had to let the world see what was really happening behind the facade of success. Vivian took a deep breath and opened the notebook. Her fingers hovered over the page for a moment as she found the words. "The truth. The real truth. I grew up in a neighborhood where hope was a currency no one could afford," she began, her writing flowing onto the paper as the memories came flooding back. "I was the daughter of a single mother who worked multiple jobs just to keep a roof over our heads. There were nights we went to bed hungry, nights I heard gunshots echoing down the block, but my mom always told me that I could do better, that I could rise above it. And I believed her. I had to. I had no choice." Her words flowed freely now, spilling onto the pages, unrestrained. The story she had kept hidden for so long was finally finding its voice. "My mother's dream was to see me out of that neighborhood. She didn't live to see that dream fulfilled. She died of a heart attack when I was 17. After that, I had to fend for myself. I knew that if I didn't make something of myself, I'd be swallowed whole by the streets, by the system that had already written me off before I even had a chance. So I worked harder than anyone. I went to college, worked multiple jobs to pay tuition, and I made sure no one ever looked down on me again." Vivian's hand paused, the weight of the words settling on her chest. She had told this story countless times, but this time it felt different. This time, it wasn't just a tale of survival. It was a declaration, a reckoning. "My success didn't come easy," she continued, her voice steady as she wrote. "I had to fight for every contract, every opportunity, every inch of respect I earned. People looked at me as if I didn't belong in the boardrooms I sat in, as if I was just some token or a fluke. But I built my empire because I knew what it was like to go without. I knew what it was like to be invisible." She let the pen hover over the page, the weight of her story heavy in her hand. There were truths here that few knew. Her name was synonymous with wealth and success now, but it hadn't always been that way. There were years of hard work, years of being dismissed, of battling not just the systems of inequality, but the biases that ran deep within the very people who were supposed to support her. Her eyes lifted to meet Detective Carter's gaze. "I've had to work twice as hard, jump through hoops that no one else ever had to even see," she said, her voice low but resolute. "I built this empire, not because I wanted to show off, but because I had to. The world doesn't give you anything if you don't fight for it." Detective Carter nodded, understanding the gravity of Vivian's words. "And now," she said, "you're going to make sure everyone knows your truth. You're going to expose what they never wanted to see. The real cost of success, the hidden price of ambition." Vivian closed the notebook, her heart pounding in her chest. "The truth," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "It's time." With those words, something inside her clicked. Vivian Sinclair was no longer going to remain silent. The injustice she had endured, the fight she had fought alone, was going to come to light. And once the world saw the truth, there would be no going back. The forces that had tried to break her would finally understand the cost of underestimating a woman like her. The world wasn't ready for the storm she was about to unleash, but Vivian was ready to face it. The chain of unraveling. The afternoon sun had begun to dip lower, casting long shadows across the street as Vivian Sinclair sat in the silence of her thoughts, notebook in hand. The chaotic exchange with Officer Walker was still fresh in her mind, but now a deeper, more visceral sense of realization had begun to settle in. What had started as a small incident, one that could have been dismissed, buried under the weight of countless others, had quickly spiraled into something much larger. The tipping point had been reached, and Vivian knew that nothing could undo what had already begun to unfold. Detective Lena Carter stood silently beside her, her calm presence grounding Vivian in the moment. She had seen Vivian's strength before, but this was something different. The fire in Vivian's eyes was no longer one of passive resistance, but of active determination. This wasn't just about defending herself in a fleeting confrontation. This was about something much bigger. This was about justice. For herself, for the countless others who had been marginalized, and for the very systems that sought to silence their voices. Vivian exhaled deeply, finally breaking the silence. "I need to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. This wasn't just about me. This is about everything that's wrong with the way people like me are treated." Detective Carter nodded, her expression resolute. "And we will. But we need to be strategic. We can't just launch an attack without careful planning. You've built something remarkable, Vivian. Don't let them turn this into a sideshow. This is your story, your truth. You control how it's told." Vivian's eyes narrowed as she considered Carter's words. For so long, she had navigated the business world by mastering the art of control, of shaping her narrative, controlling her image, and staying one step ahead of the game. But this moment was different. It wasn't just about perception or public relations anymore. This was a raw truth, one that had been buried beneath layers of success and polished veneers. Now, it was bubbling to the surface, and the consequences of exposing it would reverberate far beyond anything she could have imagined. Her gaze shifted to the notebook she still held tightly in her hands. Inside it was not just her story, but the story of an entire generation of women, people of color, and those who had been overlooked by a system that valued status over substance. She had fought to rise above the hardships of her youth, to silence the voices that told her she didn't belong. But now, those voices had returned with a vengeance. They were still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for any opportunity to tear her down. Vivian closed the notebook, her mind made up. This wasn't going to be a simple matter of one unjust officer's actions being brushed aside. No, she would make sure that Officer Walker's behavior was exposed for what it was, part of a larger system of discrimination and prejudice that needed to be dismantled. And she would use her power, her wealth, and her influence to do it. "Get me in touch with the right people," Vivian said, her voice firm, the weight of determination settling into her every word. "I want to start pushing back. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about the system that allows people like him to get away with it." Detective Carter raised an eyebrow, impressed by the shift in Vivian's demeanor. I think you're going to need more than just me for this, she said, her voice calm but serious. If you want to take on the system, you're going to need allies in high places. You've got the resources. Now we need the people who can help you turn this into a movement. Vivian's mind immediately raced. She thought of the powerful network of contacts she had built over the years. Politicians, activists, business leaders, philanthropists, all of whom would stand by her if they understood the full scope of what was at stake. She knew this battle wouldn't be won in the courtroom or through public protests alone. It would take a groundswell of support, a coalition of voices demanding accountability, one that would transcend her personal experience and speak to the larger issues at play. Vivian stood up, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. I'll make the calls, but I need you with me, Lena. We do this together, or not at all. Detective Carter's gaze softened, a hint of admiration in her eyes. I'm in, she said, her voice unwavering. We'll start with the public records. We need to gather evidence. The more we have, the stronger our case, and we need to make sure Walker's history is on full display. Vivian nodded. She knew the stakes were higher now. If she was going to tear down the walls of systemic injustice, she needed to be as meticulous in this fight as she had been in building her business. Every step had to be calculated, every move carefully orchestrated. One wrong move, one misstep, and the forces she was about to face could destroy everything she had worked for. But as Vivian looked around, she realized something. This wasn't just about a fight for her own success anymore. It was about confronting the system that kept millions of people like her from ever reaching their potential. This was about standing up for those who didn't have the platform or the privilege to fight back. Vivian's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to find a message from her assistant, Jason. The press conference is set for 10:00 a.m. tomorrow. Are you sure about this? Vivian stared at the screen for a long moment. She could almost feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest, but deep inside, she knew it was the right choice. If she truly wanted to create lasting change, she had to expose the darkness, even if it meant stepping into the spotlight herself. Yes, she typed back. It's time. As she hit send, Vivian's thoughts were momentarily interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to see a familiar face. A young woman who had been part of Vivian's inner circle for years, someone she trusted implicitly. It was Sasha, her communications director, whose work had been instrumental in shaping Vivian's public persona. Sasha, Vivian said, smiling warmly as the woman approached. I'm glad you're here. Sasha looked at Vivian, her expression one of concern mixed with curiosity. I heard about what happened with the cop. Are you okay? Vivian nodded, her mind already several steps ahead. I'm fine, but things are about to get complicated, and I need you to prepare for it. We're going public with this. Sasha's eyebrows furrowed. You're serious. You're going to expose Walker. I am. And everything else that comes with it. The world needs to see the truth, Sasha. Not just about him, but about the systems that enable people like him to get away with this. We can't keep pretending it's not happening. I've spent my whole life fighting for a place at the table. Now it's time to make sure the whole table gets a new set of rules. Sasha's eyes widened as she processed Vivian's words. She had known Vivian was a powerful woman, but this was something entirely different. This was a fight not just for one woman's dignity, but for a societal shift. Okay, Sasha said, her voice resolute. We'll need a strategy, a solid PR plan. We need to get ahead of the narrative before anyone else can control it. We'll make sure it's framed in a way that emphasizes systemic issues, not just your personal encounter. We can't afford to be reactionary. This needs to be a movement. Vivian nodded in agreement. Exactly. And we need to make sure that the world sees what's really going on, not just in the police force, but in every institution. This fight is bigger than just one officer. It's bigger than just me. It's about all of us. Sasha took a deep breath, her phone already in hand as she began typing out a plan. We'll start with the press. You're going to need a lot of media attention. We'll release a statement tomorrow, and I'll organize interviews with key outlets. We'll need to highlight the long history of misconduct and injustice, but also your journey. People need to see the woman behind the name. Vivian's heart swelled with purpose. This was what she had been waiting for. The catalyst that would bring everything into focus. No more hiding in the shadows. No more pretending that everything was fine when, deep down, she knew it wasn't. The world was about to know her truth, and the truth of so many others who had been ignored for far too long. And Vivian Sinclair would lead the charge. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the first sparks of a movement were beginning to ignite. What had started as a single confrontation was now a battle that would change the course of history, and Vivian was ready to fight. The unraveling of a system. The first light of dawn stretched across the city skyline as Vivian Sinclair stood before the mirror in her penthouse, her reflection staring back at her with a quiet intensity. It was a face she had come to recognize over the years, the face of a woman who had built her empire through grit, determination, and a relentless pursuit of success. But today, it wasn't just the face of a billionaire businesswoman. It was the face of someone about to launch a battle that would echo through the corridors of power. Vivian had always been strategic. Every decision she made was calculated, every move planned. But this was different. This wasn't just a business deal, a merger, or a negotiation. This was a war against an entire system. A system that had undervalued, ignored, and silenced women like her for far too long. And today, she was stepping into the battlefield with everything she had. She took a deep breath, her hand resting on the cold marble countertop as she steadied her nerves. The press conference was scheduled for 10:00 a.m. The media was already buzzing with rumors of what was about to unfold, and the story of the altercation with Officer Walker was circulating online. But that was only the beginning. Vivian knew that in order to truly make an impact, she had to do more than simply react. She needed to make a statement, one that would shift the narrative, not just for herself, but for every person who had been oppressed, marginalized, or forgotten. Vivian turned away from the mirror and picked up the phone, dialing a number she had memorized by heart. It rang once, then twice, before being answered. "Vivian," came the voice on the other end, strong, assured, and familiar. "I've been expecting your call." "Derek," Vivian said, her voice steady. Derek Williams was one of her closest allies, a high-profile civil rights attorney who had become a trusted confidant over the years. They had worked together on several initiatives to address systemic inequality in the corporate world, but today, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. "I'm ready to take this public," Vivian said, her tone unwavering. "We're going to expose everything. Walker's actions are just the beginning. This is about much more than him. We need to shine a light on the corruption, the discrimination, the entire system." Derek was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of her words. "Are you sure about this? Once we start, there's no going back." Vivian's jaw tightened. She had been sure about this the moment Officer Walker had belittled her on that street corner, the moment he had assumed he could get away with dehumanizing her just because of the color of her skin. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about that one officer, or even the one moment. It was about the countless others like him, people in power who used their positions to intimidate, oppress, and silence others, often with impunity. "I'm sure," Vivian said firmly. "This goes far beyond what happened to me. This is about every person who has been targeted, judged, or punished for something they had no control over. It's time to make the world see that the system is broken." Derek exhaled deeply. "Okay, we're in this together then. Let's take down the walls." The press conference was being held at a downtown hotel, one of the largest venues in the city. As Vivian arrived, the media frenzy was already in full swing. Reporters milled about, cameras set up, their eyes glued to the entrance as they waited for the key players to arrive. The air was thick with anticipation. Everyone knew something big was about to happen. but no one knew just how big. Vivian's assistant, Jason, met her at the door, his face a mask of professionalism. "Everything's set," he said. "Your statement is ready, and the press pool is in place. We've made sure the media outlets you want are here." Vivian nodded, her mind focused. "Good. Let's make sure the cameras are rolling for this." Inside the room, the buzz of conversation quieted as Vivian made her way to the podium, her confident strides silencing the crowd. The camera flashes were blinding, but Vivian didn't flinch. This was the moment she had been preparing for. It was time for the world to hear her story, but more importantly, it was time for them to hear the truth. She stepped up to the microphone, and for a moment, everything went still. The audience waited, hanging on her every word. "Good morning," Vivian said, her voice cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. "Thank you for being here today. I know many of you are wondering why I've called this press conference. What happened on that street corner last week with Officer Walker was not just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, a problem that has plagued our society for far too long." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "Many of you know me as a businesswoman. Some of you may even know me as a philanthropist. But today, I stand before you as a woman who has been wronged, a woman who has been humiliated, targeted, and oppressed simply because of the color of my skin." There was a collective gasp from the crowd, but Vivian didn't waver. She had prepared herself for this moment for years, even if she hadn't realized it. Her entire life had been a fight for visibility, for validation. Now she was fighting for something much bigger. "Let me be clear," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I am not the first person to face this kind of discrimination, and I will not be the last. But I am one of the few who has the platform to make a difference, and I intend to use that platform to expose the injustice that has existed in our system for far too long." She looked out over the sea of reporters, their eyes trained on her, waiting for the next words to leave her lips. The reality is that Officer Walker's actions were not an anomaly. They are part of a larger pattern of abuse that runs rampant in institutions across our country. Police departments, corporate boardrooms, government offices. Every day, people like me are targeted, belittled, and stripped of their dignity simply because of who we are. And if we do nothing to change it, it will continue. Vivian's voice wavered slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the words she was speaking. She had never been one to be vulnerable in public, but today, vulnerability was her strength. Today, she wasn't just a CEO or a billionaire. She was a human being who had been mistreated, just like so many others. "I spent my entire life proving myself," Vivian said, her eyes narrowing with determination. "I've built my career from the ground up, working harder than anyone ever expected me to, facing obstacles that many could never imagine. I did this not for recognition, not for fame, but because I believed in something greater than myself. I believed in the idea that hard work and perseverance could overcome any adversity. But what I've learned is that no amount of hard work will matter if the system itself is broken." The room was silent now, the gravity of her words settling on everyone in the room. Vivian had the attention of the world, and she was going to make sure they couldn't ignore her. "I'm here today because I refuse to let this continue," she said, her voice steady. "I refuse to be silent. I refuse to let my story, and the stories of so many others, go unheard. I will use my resources, my influence, and my voice to fight for change. This is not just about one officer, one incident, or one woman. This is about a system that has failed us all, and it's time to make it right." The crowd erupted in applause, but Vivian didn't flinch. She stood tall, her hands at her sides, the weight of what she had just said still sinking in. She had just ignited a firestorm that would burn through the walls of injustice, of inequality, and of silence. And Vivian Sinclair was ready to watch it all burn. The rise of a movement. The days following Vivian's press conference were a whirlwind. Her words had reverberated across every platform, from social media to news outlets, and the world was listening. But Vivian knew that this was just the beginning. The first step had been taken, and now it was time to build on it, to transform her personal confrontation into a movement that could dismantle the very systems that had oppressed so many for so long. For the first time in years, Vivian felt both the weight of her decision and the immense responsibility it carried. She was no longer just a businesswoman in a boardroom. She was the face of something bigger, a symbol of resistance, of resilience, and of the possibility of change. And she knew that if she didn't act swiftly and strategically, her message could easily be diluted, overshadowed by the forces of power that would try to silence her. Her phone rang early the next morning, disrupting the quiet that had settled over her apartment. She looked at the screen, Derek Williams, and answered without hesitation. "Vivian." Derek's voice came through with urgency. "The media response is overwhelming. They're calling for accountability. Local, state, even federal levels. People are asking for systemic reform, not just an investigation into Walker. There's already pressure on the mayor's office." Vivian leaned against the counter, her fingers absent-mindedly tapping the edge of her coffee cup. "Good. Let them feel it. Let them see how powerful this movement is." "We need to be careful with the next steps," Derek cautioned. "The moment you put yourself at the forefront like this, the opposition starts building their narrative. They'll try to discredit you. They'll attack your credibility. We need to prepare for that." Vivian's jaw tightened. "I know, but we can't let fear dictate our actions. If we back down now, we lose. If we don't take this to the next level, we're just a fleeting headline. We need to build momentum, and we need to make sure that momentum is unstoppable." "Agreed," Derek said. "But we also need a legal strategy. We can't just rely on public opinion. We need to expose the cracks in the system, the corruption, and make sure people in power can't ignore the truth anymore." "I've already spoken to some of my contacts," Vivian replied, her mind racing. "I'm mobilizing the team to start gathering data, cases, testimonies, records. We'll create an archive, a repository that proves this is not an isolated incident. I'll be meeting with activists, policymakers, and community leaders to bring them into this." "Good. But Vivian," Derek's tone softened, "we need to brace for the backlash. They'll try to paint you as an extremist, as someone who's trying to tear down everything you've built. The media will twist your words. You need to stay ahead of the curve." "I'm ready," Vivian said, her voice unwavering. "This isn't about me anymore. This is about us. The world is waking up. We're all connected by this fight. We can't afford to be passive. We need to be the change we want to see." As she hung up the phone, Vivian felt a surge of purpose course through her. This wasn't a fight she could face alone, and it wasn't something that could be won overnight. But she had a powerful tool at her disposal, her voice, and as the world's gaze was fixed upon her, she would use it to build an army of like-minded individuals ready to stand up and demand change. By the end of the week, the media storm surrounding Vivian had intensified, fueled by waves of both support and vitriol. Social media was flooded with hashtags, #JusticeForVivian, #BreakThessalence, #WeAreAtTheMovement, echoing the call for systemic reform. But with the attention also came the attacks. Opponents, both anonymous and public, sought to discredit her at every turn. Critics labeled her an opportunist, accusing her of using her platform to further her personal agenda. Some even questioned the truth of her account, trying to paint her as an exaggerator, a woman of privilege out of touch with the struggles of the everyday person. But Vivian had anticipated this. She had faced these kinds of attacks before, in the boardrooms, in the media, and from her detractors, and she had always come out on top. This time, the stakes were higher, but she knew that the people who believed in her cause would not be silenced by the noise. With Derek's guidance, Vivian began to build a coalition, a diverse network of voices, each of them a powerful force in their own right, but united under a shared vision of justice. She reached out to influential activists, local leaders, grassroots organizations, and even corporate allies who believed in the need for systemic change. The movement was beginning to take shape, but Vivian knew it was only a matter of time before those in power would try to undermine it. At the center of the coalition was a strategy built on transparency, education, and grassroots activism. Vivian's team worked tirelessly to collect testimonies and evidence, building a case not just for the wrongful actions of Officer Walker, but for the broader issue of police brutality, racial inequality, and the need for meaningful reforms in both law enforcement and society at large. But it wasn't just about the data. It was about the stories, the voices of people who had been silenced for far too long. The survivors of police violence, the families who had lost loved ones, the communities that had been systematically oppressed. Vivian knew that their stories were the most powerful weapon they had. They were the ones who would make the world listen. She organized town halls, rallies, and public forums to amplify these voices. She stood alongside survivors, offering them a platform to speak their truth, and in doing so, she was able to shift the narrative. No longer was this just a story about one woman's encounter with an abusive officer. This was a collective battle for justice, for the recognition of the humanity that had been denied to so many. As the weeks passed, Vivian's coalition grew. The movement began to gain traction in cities across the country, sparking protests, sit-ins, and marches. But Vivian knew that these actions, though powerful, were just a part of the larger strategy. She needed to go beyond the streets and push for tangible policy change. She called on lawmakers to take action, demanding that they introduce legislation that would address police reform, transparency, and accountability. Through her powerful advocacy, Vivian found herself meeting with influential political figures, including the governor and key members of Congress. Behind closed doors, the conversations were intense. They were not just about public policy. They were about shifting the very foundations of how power was wielded in this country. Vivian was determined to hold those in power accountable, no matter how difficult the fight would be. As she sat in a meeting with the governor, Vivian felt the weight of the conversation. She had walked into countless meetings like this before, but today felt different. Today, the stakes were not just about securing a business deal or negotiating a contract. They were about rewriting the rules of society. "The time for small steps is over," Vivian said firmly, her voice echoing in the polished conference room. "We need bold action. We need policies that make a real difference, policies that will hold people accountable, that will demand transparency, and that will dismantle the systems of oppression that have been allowed to fester for far too long." The governor leaned forward, eyes fixed on her. "And you believe we can make that happen?" "I know we can," Vivian replied. "But it takes more than just words. It takes action. And if you're not ready to act, then you'll be left behind. We're not backing down. This movement is unstoppable." The governor nodded slowly, his face a mixture of admiration and apprehension. "You've made it clear, Vivian. I'll take your words to heart." Vivian's heart pounded in her chest. The doors had been opened. The momentum was building. And she wasn't going to stop until the walls came down. Back at her penthouse, Vivian stood at the window, looking out over the city. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the skyline. For a moment, she allowed herself to pause, to breathe. But she knew this wasn't the time to rest. The journey had only just begun. She had taken the first step, a bold, unwavering step, into a fight that would shape the future. She had taken on the system, and the system was beginning to crack. But there was still so much more to be done. The real work was just beginning. Vivian Sinclair had always believed that success was about more than just building an empire. It was about using that empire to make a difference. Now she had the chance to do just that, to rise above the noise, to change the narrative, and to leave a legacy that would inspire generations to come. And she wasn't going to stop until she had done exactly that.